Hey everyone, I'm Michael Fangman, product designer for Secure Dynamic Analysis. This video is to walk you through a revised design proposal for DAST pre-scan verification. Before we get into the design proposal, I first want to give you a little bit of background and context around the user problem that we're trying to solve here. So as it stands today, users can configure DAST scans directly within the UI. So they can configure DAST for on-demand scans or DAST for their CI/CD. And they can do that directly within the UI, but they have no way of being able to verify configuration details or identify errors within the configuration other than just running a full scan and waiting for it to complete. Sometimes that process might be quick, like if we aren't able to find the scan target, but there are other times when it may take quite a while to scan and we actually don't know and can't service configuration errors until after the scan is fully complete. And this issue is especially more prevalent for areas like on-demand scheduled scans or CI/CD DAST scans, where the scanning typically happens sometime in the future, usually a while after the configuration has been completed. So allowing users to be able to verify their configuration details of a scan before implementing it will hopefully help them to save time, to reduce configuration errors, and to increase, hopefully just have an increased confidence in the tool as well. So when approaching the solution for this, there were a few requirements and constraints that we had to adhere to. So the first of which is that pre-scan verification generally is most relevant within the context of a full scan configuration page. So in this case, we knew that we wanted to make the feature available from on-demand scan configuration page, as well as from the DAST CI/CD configuration page. We also knew that pre-scan verification was going to run as a pipeline job, so it made sense to align sort of on the design patterns and paradigms that we're currently using to communicate the status of the jobs within the UI. And then the last requirement is that we knew that it would sometimes take quite a while or a little bit of time for pre-scan verification to complete. And so we wanted to be able to allow users to navigate away from the page and be able to come back and check on the status of that in the future if they wanted to. And so about a week and a half ago, I put together a first version of this process where essentially I was proposing as adding pre-scan verification as its own separate step or section directly within the configuration form. So in this example, we see it within the context of on-demand scans where you have sort of your main configuration sections across the top. And then at the very bottom, we're just adding another section for pre-scan verification. I think after presenting this initial proposal, we got a lot of great feedback on sort of the general approach, but there was some feedback around the placement of this and how it was positioned within the UI. And generally, the feedback that we received is that this section created sort of or had a large footprint overall and made the configuration form just feel more complex and intimidating than it needed to be. Also, the way that this was presented made pre-scan verification feel like it was a required step in the process. And the truth of the matter is it's an entirely optional step and sort of an ancillary action that users don't have to take, but it's there if they want to. And the way this is presented sort of didn't really align with that reality. And then also I learned from presenting out this initial version is that we actually have to save the configuration form before we can run pre-scan verification. So presenting the pre-scan verification option directly in line within the configuration form that needed to be saved kind of created this weird paradigm where we either needed to somehow communicate to users that they were saving their scan before running or just saving it automatically for them. And it kind of created this weird workflow that was really strange. So after taking the different feedback points into consideration, essentially put together a new revised version that still leans on a lot of the same sort of concepts and ways pre-scan verification is being presented and proposed here. Essentially, we're just looking at, instead of presenting it in line with the configuration form, moving it outside of the configuration form so it can come after configuration is complete. And so really what that allows is it allows users to come in and then focus first on the configuration of their scan itself without any distractions or anything of that sort. So in this case, we're looking at on-demand scans. So they can still come in here and then the on-demand scans page looks exactly the same as it would whether pre-scan verification was available or not. It doesn't matter, this page is exactly the same. And then after the configuration form is completed, that's when then we would add a new option to be able to test and verify that configuration. So as it stands today, we're already presenting users with sort of 3 primary actions at the bottom of an on-demand configuration form. So they can save and run a scan. This is typically the main primary action that they would typically use, but then they also have the option to just save the scan and exit out of this configuration process, or just exit out of the configuration process without saving anything at all. And so adding a 4th option in here obviously creates a bit of information overload and makes it hard for users to decide which is the right action that they need to take, just adding a little sort of additional mental strain on them. So I'm proposing we do a little bit of refinement here by adding a 4th option, looking at sort of using, instead of presenting all the options at sort of an equal weight, using a split drop-down button where we have the main primary action presented to users, but then tucking away some of these other ancillary tasks under a drop-down option. And so obviously the discoverability of this feature is not great. Tucking away these ancillary options within a secondary menu can easily be missed by users. So I'd love any sort of feedback around this approach, and if there may be alternative ways we can address this and tackle this and make it so that pre-scan verification and even these other actions are accessible, but not really demanding too much attention, if you will. But anyway, once you actually were to come in here, and if you were to select save and test configuration, essentially what would happen is users are going to remain on this page. We would then fire a toast as soon as you click this, just confirming to users that we've saved their configuration, and then open the pre-scan verification panel, or in this case, it's a drawer. So if we're clicking on that, we can see the toast comes up and says the scan was saved to their library. And then we have this drawer where then users can go through the pre-scan verification process. And so if you've never run pre-scan verification before on a scan, essentially this is what you would see, where you get a brief overview of what pre-scan verification is. In this case, it just says test your configuration and identify potential errors before running a full scan. And then they'd get a summary of all of the checks that will be running for this pre-scan verification. And if users aren't familiar with what pre-scan verification checks are, there's a little tooltip here that gives them a little bit more detail around them and how they function based on if you were to change your configuration details and things of that sort. But then users can come in here, and so they really only have one main action here, and that's to run pre-scan verification. And if they were to do that, what would happen is we'd essentially then, once we queue up a pipeline and then essentially load in a alert or a way to communicate what pipeline is running pre-scan verification and then the status of that pipeline itself. And so this helps users to understand when pre-scan verification was last run, and then gives them access to that pipeline so they can dig into the details of that job if they want to. And then once a pre-scan verification job is complete, we'd hopefully be able to update the status of that pipeline directly within the UI here, and then parse that report and show the status of each of the different checks that we run. And essentially it would be sort of a pass-fail for each of these checks, and then just a short area to communicate either that we were successful with the check, or just communicating what failed. And so what that looks like here, so for connection and target exploration, both of those passed. So we're just notating and confirming the user that was the case. And then for authentication, there was an error, so we're showing that error message here. And then there's also the option to download the job artifacts, or in this case, it just says download results, but essentially be able to download the different job artifacts for each of these to understand a little bit more detail around how each of the checks went. And so that's essentially the high-level overview of this feature. There's a few other small ancillary pieces around communicating the status of this outside of this page and outside of this drawer that I think are worth covering. So I'll go ahead and touch on that. So if a pre-scan verification job were currently running, say, and a user were to close out this drawer but remain on the configuration page, essentially what we would do is when the job is complete, we would then show a toast on this page that would link directly to that drawer. Then users could basically parse the report and look at sort of the status of each of these checks. And then similarly, if a pre-scan job was running and a user had navigated outside of the security section altogether, or just back to sort of the main on-demand scan or CI/CD scan configuration page, whenever that pre-scan verification job is complete, and if it hadn't been reviewed before, we'd essentially show an alert message at the top of the page, letting them know that the job is complete, and then linking again directly to the results of that job. And then in the same light of just making sure that this feature is a little bit more visible and discoverable, Also looking at, so for DAST on-demand scans, obviously we have to save a job or a configuration before we can run a pre-scan verification. So when that's the case, I essentially think we should also add a option or a column within the save scan library, essentially showing the different pre-scan verification statuses for each of the saved jobs. And so if it had never been run before, it doesn't apply. The pre-scan verification status would just be null or blank. But then also if it had run, you'd be able to see sort of the current status of it, or if it had been invalidated. And then I guess the last thing to really touch on here is around invalidated pre-scan verification jobs. So really, there's a couple of things that can invalidate a pre-scan verification job. It really comes down to just making changes to the configuration itself. And so for DAST, we have the concept of profiles, where essentially the main how DAST is configured is you have essentially your site's profile and your target profile. And then these profiles are actually managed outside of the main configuration area. And so it's possible for the same profile to be used in two separate scans. And so a user could change a profile in one scan, and that would invalidate the pre-scan verification status within your current scan. And so it's a little bit of a weird situation, but essentially to communicate that to users, what would happen is, let's view the results. So if they were to come in and let's just, for instance, say that this configuration has changed, when they go to open up that pre-scan verification drawer, we'd essentially just add an alert across the top, letting them know that the pre-scan verification status has been reset, telling them why. In this case, it's obviously just that the configuration details have been changed, and then linking out to that last pipeline where it was run, so they can at least still have access to the old job if they wanted it. And then users could come in here and rerun that pre-scan verification if they wanted to. And obviously, being that pre-scan verification, changing configuration details may invalidate the actual job itself. If you were to come in here and try to edit details of a job while the scan is running, we wouldn't block users from doing that, but we do want to just warn them that by making configuration changes here, it may alter or reset the pre-scan verification status, and just asking them to confirm that they do want to continue with that action. And if they did want to, they could continue editing and make any changes they wanted to. I think the last thing to really show here, so obviously I mostly demonstrated how this would work within CI/CD or within the on-demand scan configuration section. Just quickly want to show you what it would look like for CI/CD too. So for CI/CD scans, obviously we don't have the concept of saving each individual scan instance. You essentially just have an area where you can create your configuration, and then you would insert it into your YAML file. There's no saving or anything involved. So in this case, within the configuration page, we essentially just have a secondary option here to be able to test your configuration, and that would essentially test the pre-scan verification of the active or visible profile configuration. And if you were to click that, it would just open up the same type of drawer. And ideally, the process would be exactly the same as it is for CI/CD or for on-demand. I'm sure there'll probably be a few small little changes and tweaks and edge cases we'll have to account for, but hopefully the two experiences would be very, very similar in that regard. Yeah, I think that pretty much covers it. Any and all feedback is welcome. Feel free to leave comments in the issues directly on the video, or message me in Slack. Particularly a couple things I'm wondering about is any thoughts on the placement and discoverability of this feature, if sort of tucking it away in this ancillary drop-down menu feels appropriate, or if we need to be a little bit more prominent around communicating the status of this directly on the configuration page. Also wondering if we seem to be doing a good job communicating the status of the scans, like when they complete using the toast message, or if they've completed and users have navigated elsewhere, using alert messages on the main index page of where they were initiated to communicate the status. If those and some of the other ways we're approaching this do a good job communicating the status, or if there's better ways to approach that. So like I said, any and all feedback is welcome. And thanks again for taking the time to watch.